We're going to do a high-speed yet really meticulous examination of a company that, it fundamentally changed how the world moves.
But spent years just struggling to define its own ethics. Uber.
Yeah, it is arguably the definitive case study of that Silicon Valley growth at all costs philosophy just colliding head-on with corporate accountability.
So our mission in this deep dive is pretty crucial. We need to analyze this dramatic, almost traumatic transformation Uber went through after its cultural and ethical implosion.
Exactly. We're going to focus on the highly methodical turnaround strategy of the current CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, and this is the key part, we have to critically ask if that profound cultural reset actually extended to the fundamental and often very opaque economics of their massive marketplace.
And our sources for this give us a truly comprehensive view. We're looking at everything from internal corporate documents about the cultural reset to, external economic analysis that bravely calls out some truly inconvenient truths.
Especially about pricing and driver compensation.
We're talking about a true global titan here. By 2020, Uber was operating in over 63 countries, something like 700 cities globally.
It's hard to even remember, but by 2015, just 6 years after it was founded, articles were already declaring there's an Uber for everything now. That's just how fast and how dominantly the platform established itself.
The scale is just staggering, and I think it's important for you to understand the actual business structure we're even talking about.
Right. So if you look at their core operations as of, say, 2020, the traditional ride-hailing part, which they call the ride segment, that was still the engine. It accounted for over 75% of Uber's reported revenue in 2019.
That's dominance. But the Eats segment, which it just exploded during the pandemic. That was rapidly gaining relevance, right?
Precisely. The Eat segment made up about 18% of revenue, with the freight division and micromobility, the e-bikes and e-scooters making up the small remainder.
But there's critical geographic note in here, too.
A huge one. Despite being this massive global company, Uber's financial heart is still North America. Over 60% of their 2019 revenue came from just the United States and Canada alone.
And that disproportionate reliance is going to be really vital when we start talking about the U.S. regulatory threats later on.
Absolutely. So by the time Khosrowshahi takes the helm in 2017, the company is this global giant, but it's basically sitting on a ticking time bomb of foundational conflicts.
So if we had to distill the immediate problems he inherited, what were those central conflicts?
I'd say there are 3 massive intertwined challenges that were threatening to derail the entire enterprise. The first and most visible one was the corporate culture.
Right.
It was deeply publicly toxic. It was just rife with accusations of discrimination, sexism, sexual harassment. It made Uber synonymous with reckless Silicon Valley entitlement.
So that was the public relations nightmare. But what was the existential threat?
The existential threat was all about labor. They had to settle the status of their massive global workforce. Are Uber drivers independent contractors, or are they employees?
And that determination is worth billions.
Yeah.
Literally.
Billions. Reclassifying drivers as employees would trigger all these mandated costs. Social Security, Medicare taxes, minimum wage, overtime. It would have fundamentally shattered their financial model.
And despite the scale, the third challenge was just basic financial maturity. They still weren't consistently profitable, especially after that rocky IPO.
Exactly. The May 2019 IPO, which should have been a triumph, saw the stock perform terribly. The sources describe it as having a troubling performance. By the third quarter of 2019, Uber posted a massive operating loss of $1.1 billion.
So the new leadership had to fix the culture, defend the labor model, and prove the company could actually make money, all at the same time.
A monumental task.
So our deep dive is really focused on analyzing that break from the chaotic founding era. We're going to look at the cultural and strategic pivot under Khosrowshahi, specifically his doctrine of self-critique, and then investigate the core economic model.
And ask that key question. Did that commitment to organizational transparency ever reach the most critical and arguably the most sensitive area of the business?
The financial relationship between what riders pay and what drivers actually take home. Okay, let's unpack that initial culture first, because understanding the toxicity under the founder, Travis Kalanick, is absolutely essential for appreciating the transformation that came later.
For sure. Uber became notorious for embodying that aggressive, move fast and break things, Silicon Valley ethos.
So what did the day-to-day work environment actually look like for employees?
Well, the sources, they paint a very specific picture. A quintessential, hyper-competitive tech giant with a relentless work hard, play hard culture. Long hours weren't just expected, they were, highly valued and linked directly to your career progression.
And this whole atmosphere was designed to maximize performance and growth at all costs.
All costs, and the kind of person who thrived in that environment.
How was that?
It was overwhelmingly homogenous, predominantly young, white, and male. The culture really selected for employees who were aggressive, risk-tolerant, and perfectly willing to push boundaries.
And Kalanick hired based on instinct, which just perpetuated that.
Exactly. And the systems they used to evaluate these employees were just as troubling.
How so?
They were described as problematically arbitrary. You could get a poor evaluation, potentially damaging your entire career with just minimal justification. You would get a bad review simply for a perceived lack of hustle.
Wow.
Yeah, so it incentivized this internal competition and aggression over any kind of collaboration, creating this zero-sum, high-pressure, and often adversarial internal ecosystem.
And that kind of pressure cooker.
Yeah.
It just inevitably leads to misconduct. The sources cite aggressive behavior, sexism, abuse, and this was happening in offices worldwide.
Unfortunately, yes. You mix that high-stakes environment with a significant party environment fueled by alcohol and drug use, and you get a stunning lack of professionalism and ethical boundaries.
And we're not just talking about workplace bullying here.
No, not at all. The sources include some deeply shocking details that really illustrate the magnitude of the problem.
And that incident in Thailand, that really crystallizes the kind of white-knuckle pressure that employees felt they had to endure.
It's a horrific example. In an office in Thailand, a female employee who was actively abstaining from drug use, she reportedly complained that she was physically pushed face down onto a table by her manager and violently forced to inhale cocaine.
By her manager.
Allegedly, yes. That level of coercion and abuse demonstrates just how far the work hard, play hard culture had mutated into this dangerous, lawless environment where performance was prioritized over basic human decency or safety.
So while that toxic internal culture was festering, the external safety and liability crises started piling up.
And they often revolved around Uber's legal position that its drivers were independent contractors and therefore not fully their responsibility.
Let's start with the San Francisco accident in 2013, a truly devastating incident.
This collision on December 31st, 2013 was a massive tipping point because of Uber's calculated response. An Uber driver, who was reportedly using the app, collided with a family in a crosswalk. Tragically, a 6-year-old girl was killed.
And her mother and brother were severely injured.
Yeah, life-altering injuries. And the family, as you'd expect, sued Uber.
How did Uber try to deflect responsibility?
Their response was immediate and totally focused on diminishing responsibility through a technicality. They claimed the driver was not on a booked trip at the moment of impact, even though the Uber app was demonstrably open and running.
So they argued the driver was acting purely as a private citizen.
Right, and therefore wasn't eligible to be covered by the company's commercial insurance policy. They were arguing that if no fare was accepted, the company had zero liability. Uber's official statement at the time said the tragedy did not involve a vehicle or provider doing a trip on the Uber system. It was a clear attempt to distance the brand entirely from the tragedy.
And that calculating stance, exploiting the gap between app open and trip accepted, it had massive legislative consequences, didn't it?
It directly led to legislative reform in California. Because of this tragedy, the state mandated that Uber and other similar companies had to offer third-party liability insurance.
And that insurance had to cover the gap.
Exactly. It had to cover third parties in cases of property damage, injury, or death, even if a driver merely had the app open and was waiting for a ride request. It closed the loophole Uber had tried to exploit.
Then, just a year later, in 2014, Uber faces a crisis in Delhi, India, that revealed this dangerous commitment to regional regulatory minimums over, universal safety standards.
Yeah, the Delhi rape allegations caused international outrage. A woman was assaulted by her driver. The investigation then revealed that Uber had hired this driver even though he'd been previously arrested in connection with sexual assault charges.
He had been acquitted, but the arrest should have been a massive red flag. Why wasn't it?
Because Uber failed to conduct a proper background check. A local Uber official confirmed this, stating that conducting such a check was not a requirement of the Indian government.
So they were just doing the bare minimum.
Prioritizing speed and market entry over mandatory global safety standards, that failure led to the city of Delhi swiftly banning Uber altogether, which was a major blow.
And these incidents just kept stacking up, right? Culminating in the Kalamazoo shootings in 2016.
This was chilling because it demonstrated the sheer level of access and opacity Uber afforded its drivers. An Uber driver in Michigan committed multiple random killings over several hours.
And the most shocking detail was that he continued to pick up and drop off fares between the killings.
Right. Passengers were sometimes completely unaware they were riding with an active killer. I mean, one passenger even described jumping out of the car after the driver started driving erratically.
It's horrifying.
It raised all these serious questions again about Uber's background checks, its lack of real-time monitoring. The sheer scale and frequency of these crises meant that by 2017, the pressure was just unbearable.
Which brings us to the self-inflicted wounds that led to the founder's downfall. It started with the politically charged #DeleteUber campaign in early 2017.
Kalanick, still CEO, had secured a seat on President Trump's Technology Council. So when the January 2017 travel ban sparked protests, particularly at major hubs like JFK Airport, New York taxi drivers went on strike in solidarity.
And Uber made a disastrous decision.
A truly disastrous one. They turned off surge pricing in the area.
And the public interpreted this as what?
As Uber trying to undercut striking workers and profit off the political unrest, the backlash was explosive. The #DeleteUber campaign went viral immediately, leading to at least 500,000 users deleting their Uber accounts in just a matter of days.
500,000 users. Competitor Lyft must have been thrilled.
They got an immediate massive boost in business. Kalanick tried to mitigate the damage, but the public trust was just broken.
And then, just weeks later, the internal cultural rot just erupted into the public eye, thanks to former employee Susan Fowler.
Fowler's blog post in February 2017 was a corporate bombshell. She claimed she was sexually harassed by her direct supervisor on her very first day. When she reported it to HR, the supervisor wasn't reprimanded.
Instead, she was the one who was sort of shunted aside.
Exactly. And she realized it was systemic. She heard similar stories from numerous other female employees confirming that harassment was widespread and that HR was actively dismissing complaints to protect high performers.
So what were the results of the investigation Uber was forced to launch?
The independent investigation looked into a staggering 215 complaints. It ultimately led to over 20 employees being terminated. But even during the company meeting convened specifically to address these allegations, a board member made a sexist joke.
You're kidding.
Nope. He was forced to resign immediately. The culture was so deeply embedded that even the people in charge of governance couldn't behave themselves.
If #DeleteUber was a PR disaster and Fowler was a cultural disaster, the CEO's own actions provided the final catalyst. That video with the driver.
That was the final undeniable straw. On February 28th, Kalanick was caught on camera yelling at an Uber black driver, Fauzi Camel, who was complaining about deep rate cuts.
And Camel telling him he was going bankrupt.
Yeah, he said, "I lost $97,000 because of you. I'm bankrupt because of you."
And Kalanick didn't react with empathy.
Not at all. He yelled bullshit at the driver's complaint. And as he got out of the car, he delivered that infamous line, "Some people don't like to take responsibility for their own shit."
Just incredibly condescending.
Aggressive, condescending, and it just showed a profound inability to acknowledge the economic consequences of his own company's actions. He issued a profound apology almost immediately, but the damage was irreversible.
So that, combined with everything else, led to pressure from investors.
Intense pressure from Uber's 5 largest investors, which forced his resignation in June 2017. And the stage was set for a total cultural reset.
So, enter Dara Khosrowshahi, the former CEO of Expedia. He comes in a few months after Kalanick's resignation, and he's immediately tasked with saving the company's reputation. What was the absolute first signal he sent?
He immediately changed the company's mission statement, which, under Kalanick, was this aggressive technical decree: make transportation as reliable as running water.
Right.
Khosrowshahi transformed it into something humane and purposeful, igniting opportunity by setting the world in motion.
That's a subtle but really profound shift, isn't it? From technical logistics like plumbing to human purpose.
It was fundamental. It signaled that the company was now focused on the impact it had on people, not just the efficiency of its engineering. And he followed this up by tackling the toxic internal culture head-on.
With a new set of core values.
Exactly, and they were explicitly designed as a repudiation of the culture created under Kalanick.
So what did those new values emphasize?
The core new value was unambiguous and directly opposed to the past culture of aggression. We do the right thing, period. Others focused heavily on inclusion and accountability. We celebrate differences, and We act like owners.
And Khosrowshahi
Uh,
publicly acknowledged that some of the old values had been weaponized, right?
He did. He said the value, be tenacious, had often morphed into an excuse for employees to think it's okay to be an asshole, so he was systematically dismantling the language of the old regime.
And he didn't just change the mission statement. He implemented immediate, measurable accountability, starting with an apology tour.
Yes, his first 2 years were essentially an apology tour. He traveled the globe meeting with regulators, city officials, and driver groups to repair all the relationships Kalanick's hubris had shattered.
And internally,
Internally, he hired the company's first chief diversity officer, Bo Young Lee, to overhaul the system, and he had to deal with the legal fallout.
the class action suit.
Precisely. In 2018, Uber settled a huge $10 million class action suit filed by women and people of color who claimed they were systematically passed over for promotions and paid less.
And the settlement wasn't just monetary.
No, it required Uber to completely revamp its pay practices and institute mentoring programs. And most critically, diversity goals were integrated directly into executive evaluations and their compensation.
So it hit their paychecks.
Exactly. Specific targets were set, and meeting them affected the executive's paycheck. Accountability was finally tied to the bottom line.
This cultural reform relies heavily on what the research calls the doctrine of intentional dissatisfaction. That sounds deliberately provocative. What does it mean?
It's Khosrowshahi's governing philosophy. It's basically a system of radical, institutionalized self-critique, and it's explicitly designed as an anti-hubris mechanism.
So he's forcing them to look for flaws, even when things are going well.
That's the key. He said that during good times, leaders have to be the asshole, meaning they must actively look for failures, drive discipline, and seek out problems, because positive signals can easily hide poor work.
And he demonstrated this with his personal undercover boss tactic, which is now legendary.
He realized that no amount of internal reporting could overcome the executive disconnect. So in June 2021, he started delivering food for Uber Eats on an e-bike. Then, in September 2022, he took it a step further.
He drove passengers.
In his Tesla Model Y, under the alias Dave K.
So what critical immediate lessons did he take away from being Dave K out in the field?
He found the apps incredibly difficult to use, not the rider app, but the driver app. He experienced confusion with delivery protocols, passenger pickups.
A whole system for the workers.
Exactly. The critical lesson he brought back to the executive suite was this. The company had an excessive institutional focus on optimizing the consumer-side applications while simultaneously neglecting the foundational products and tools utilized by the supply-side workforce.
He learned that Uber's engineering success was fundamentally lopsided, a huge operational blind spot.
A massive one. And that firsthand experience became the basis for institutionalizing critique across the whole organization, leading to that infamous all-hands meeting.
One titled, Why We Suck.
Exactly. He called this meeting and he admitted it wasn't a pleasant all-hands. But that blunt, uncompromising title was essential. It served as a landmark event, officially ending the culture of denial.
And he used that collective embarrassment to drive change.
Immediate, prioritized corrective action aimed at fixing the driver experience. He even put mechanisms in place to keep the executive team focused on ground-level reality, like giving employees a little badge on their corporate profile if they drive or deliver.
So he turned what was executive ignorance into a company point of pride.
He did. And this focus on fixing operational failures and cultural toxicity also justified a major strategic pivot for the company.
Moving them towards profitability.
Khosrowshahi used this intense internal critique to justify aggressive divestiture. He publicly acknowledged where Uber had failed, stating the company sucked at ventures like building autonomous technology, manufacturing bikes and scooters, and building flying cars.
Those were the expensive, non-core distractions under Kalanick.
Precisely. By publicly admitting failure, he rationalized cutting those programs and pivoting the company back toward its core profitable services. It even led to a symbolic change. The aggressive war room at headquarters was renamed the Peace Room.
So culturally and operationally, the transformation was undeniable. He took a company that was financially scattered and ethically bankrupt and made it focused and accountable.
But the question is, does fixing the culture necessarily fix the underlying machine that generates the profit?
And that takes us to the economic battlefield. This shift toward discipline and cultural focus, it certainly stemmed Uber's hemorrhaging. But now we enter the economic side of the ledger, which is where transparency, well, it appears to become extremely selective.
Yeah, let's start with the foundational issue. The gig economy labor model that underpins everything.
Right.
We have to remember the context. The U.S. gig economy was estimated at 34% of the workforce in 2017, and it was growing fast. Uber's entire financial structure relies on classifying drivers as independent contractors.
Because if they're contractors, Uber avoids all those costs.
Yeah.
Social Security, Medicare, minimum wage.
Sick leave, overtime. It's a huge cost saver. But that contractor designation is under constant regulatory attack, especially in the U.S., which, remember, provides 60% of their revenue.
It's an existential threat. The perfect example is California's Assembly Bill 5, or AB 5, which took effect in January 2020.
That legislation established the strict ABC test for defining independent contractors, which fundamentally challenges Uber's entire labor model.
So let's break down that ABC test, because understanding why it's a threat is vital. What are the three parts?
Okay, so to remain a contractor, the worker has to satisfy all three parts. Part A requires the worker to be free from the company's control and direction.
Which is already tricky with Uber's app and rules.
Very tricky. Part B requires the worker to be doing work that is outside the usual course of the company's business. This is the biggest hurdle for Uber. I mean, if Uber's business is providing rides, the driver is doing exactly the usual course of business.
That seems like an immediate failure for Uber.
It's seen that way by regulators. And Part C requires the worker to be customarily engaged in an independently established trade or business. While some drivers meet this, the vast majority rely almost exclusively on Uber for their income.
So if any one of those three parts fails, they have to be reclassified as employees.
Correct. And the resulting cost shock of mandatory reclassification in major markets like California, Minnesota, and Washington, which are now enacting similar rules, would be catastrophic to Uber's financial statement.
It would fundamentally alter their path to profitability.
Which is why Uber spends enormous amounts of money fighting this legislation. They have to defend the contractor model at all costs.
Now, let's look at pricing for the consumer. When Khosrowshahi discusses why ride prices have increased so sharply since he took over, what's his public narrative?
His public narrative attributes the price hikes to macroeconomics general inflation. He's been quoted saying, "Everything is more expensive. Inflation has become a part of our everyday life."
Which is a convenient deflection. It makes Uber look like a passive victim of global trends.
It does. But, and this is where the opacity begins, documented analysis shows that Uber began sharply raising its U.S. rideshare prices faster than the Consumer Price Index, starting in late 2017.
A period when inflation was actually low.
Very low, below 2%. The analysis concludes that Uber's pricing strategy was designed specifically for margin expansion, increasing the gap between what the rider pays and what the driver receives. They were maximizing their profit, then using the generalized concept of inflation to obscure their own aggressive role.
So they were doing exactly what Kalanick was blamed for, but just more methodically, under the guise of good governance. This leads directly to the most controversial part: driver compensation.
Uber made a critical, highly strategic shift in 2022 to the Upfront Fares Destination model, which we call UFD.
How did this fundamentally change driver pay?
Historically, Uber used a predictable pay model. Drivers got a guaranteed base fare plus predictable per mile and per minute rates. It was clear. The shift to UFD replaced that with a system where Uber gained complete discretionary control over how its opaque algorithms determine driver pay.
That phrase, complete discretionary control, it sounds like Uber essentially created a black box.
They did. They leveraged their asymmetric information advantage using sophisticated AI. In simple terms, Uber knows everything. The driver's history, the rider's willingness to pay, traffic demand. The driver only knows the price offered for that one trip.
So they use that to offer the lowest possible fee.
The absolute lowest possible fee they predict that specific driver will accept, rather than paying a guaranteed rate based on distance and time.
So instead of a fixed rate, they're paying a customized lowest bid rate based on a psychological profile.
Exactly. They introduce schemes like Trip Radar, which is basically an online option where nearby drivers all see a trip and essentially race to the bottom to accept the lowest offer before someone else grabs it.
And what was the quantifiable impact of these changes on the people actually doing the work?
The financial results are staggering. Gridwise data, which tracks millions of trips, showed that driver earnings declined by 15% to 17% year-on-year in 2023.
A near 20% decline in pay. And their operating costs must have been rising at the same time.
They were. This drop in net income happened even as vehicle ownership and operating costs, fuel, insurance, maintenance were rising significantly. Drivers were getting a smaller slice of a growing pie while their expenses climbed.
This brings us to the most contentious discussion in the entire industry, Uber's take rate. Let's define it as it's widely understood, and then look at Uber's pushback.
The take rate is understood as the raw percentage difference between what the rider pays and what the driver receives. It's the portion Uber keeps. External analysis estimated that after the UFD implementation, Uber's take rate spiked dramatically to 40% by Q3 2023.
40%. That is a monumental cut for a platform that just connects two people.
It is. And that jump was directly credited with boosting the company's annual operating cash flow by billions, all directly at the driver's expense. But when they were confronted with this 40% figure,
They deployed what you call financial narrative arbitrage. They changed the goalposts.
precisely, they pushed back hard. Spokespersons called the 40% figure irresponsibly wrong. And they did this by redefining the term. They argued that if you subtract things like insurance and booking fees, which they call pass-throughs, the actual take rate is much lower.
But those pass-throughs are still costs of doing business that the driver, the contractor, is effectively covering.
Correct. By redefining the metric, they obscured the total revenue extracted from the driver's labor. They even changed the term in their earnings reports from take rate to the more benign-sounding revenue margin.
But the drivers see the raw numbers. They weren't fooled.
Not at all. One driver summed it up perfectly, saying, "We, the drivers, are subsidizing what Uber is giving to the rider."
Uber's entire strategy relies on protecting this information, asymmetry keeping drivers and riders in the dark. How did they do that?
This is where Khosrowshahi's commitment to transparency just completely fails to extend into economic policy. For riders since 2016, they've used opaque upfront pricing. You get a fixed price from the black box with no transparency on the base fare or surge multiplier.
And what happens when third-party tech tries to make those prices transparent?
Uber actively blocks it. For consumers, tools like the Obi app compare prices across competitors. Uber has threatened to deactivate users who use these tools, citing a violation of its terms of service under the guise of security.
So they're using their terms of service to thwart price discovery.
A classic anti-competitive maneuver. And for drivers, the blockades are even more aggressive.
Drivers use support apps to fight back, right?
Exactly. Apps like Maximo and Para help them set personalized pay thresholds and automate trip acceptance. This is the only way for a driver to exercise agency as a true independent business owner.
And Uber shut them down.
In the US, they began disabling critical functions in these apps, putting specific blockers in their own app. They explicitly disabled the features that help drivers efficiently evaluate pay rates, thwarting any attempt to counter Uber's algorithmic control.
So they're demanding drivers remain in the dark.
Reacting to whatever discretionary offer the algorithm presents, ensuring the company maintains maximum profitability.
So this analysis clearly reveals a company with this bifurcated persona. Culturally transformed, but economically opaque.
Oh.
Before we connect all these threads, let's quickly review Uber's financial reality post-IPO.
The IPO in May 2019 was historically rough. The worst first-day performance for a giant U.S. IPO by a wide margin. By Q3 2019, they posted that huge operating loss of $1.1 billion. This was a major motivator for Khosrowshahi's focus on profitability.
And globally, they recognized they couldn't win every battle, which led to some strategic retreats.
Right. Khosrowshahi oversaw strategic pruning. They exited fierce markets like China, selling to Didi, and Southeast Asia, selling to Grab. This was part of that strategic discipline admitting failure.
But they remain committed to India.
The third largest ride-sharing market, yes. Despite fierce competition from Ola Cabs, this global focus helped stabilize their finances.
We also can't ignore the high-stakes autonomous risk.
The autonomous vehicle technology, or ATG, segment has faced severe turbulence and tragedy after the 2018 self-driving vehicle fatality in Arizona,
Where a self-driving Uber struck and killed a pedestrian.
Khosrowshahi immediately halted operations. And he made a crucial public statement emphasizing that Uber must stand for safety. This shows his commitment to ethical accountability in an area of high physical risk, a profound difference from the response to the 2013 San Francisco accident.
So let's bring it all together now. Khosrowshahi successfully transformed Uber from an organization defined by chaotic personal risk to one defined by institutional resilience. But the central critique remains one of selective transparency.
That is the defining characteristic of this second era of Uber. He deployed a master strategy of calculated candor. He gained credibility by aggressively and publicly addressing issues that were easily verifiable and highly damaging. The toxic culture, the operational deficits like the poor driver app, and the non-core bets.
He earned trust by saying, we suck at the ethical and operational stuff,
Yeah.
and we're fixing it with radical transparency.
Exactly. But then he strategically deflected criticism from the core financial policies like pricing and driver pay-by, blaming macroeconomics or redefining financial metrics,
So this allowed him to prioritize shareholder financial returns.
which spiked sharply after the UFD pay model was implemented. The critique is that this genuine cultural shift, the doctrine of intentional dissatisfaction, did not translate into a genuine economic reckoning.
He cleaned up the organization, but he failed to clean up the marketplace economics. And this leads to the existential threat still masking beneath Uber's current stability.
The stability is an illusion masking a fundamental systemic risk. By relying on these market imbalances, keeping driver pay low through algorithmic opacity, the company remains acutely vulnerable to adverse regulatory mandates.
So if major states successfully mandate employee classification or even just high minimum pay rates like we're seeing in Minnesota and Washington, what happens to their profitability?
The resulting cost shock could wipe out all the efficiency gains achieved since 2017. Uber is currently managing symptoms, the bad PR, the bad culture, the bad apps, while allowing the root disease of volatile marketplace reliance to fester.
So their financial success is currently built on a foundation that could be pulled out from under them.
By a few key state legislatures or a federal ruling, the long-term risk of a workforce that feels exploited is that it becomes fertile ground for unionization and successful regulatory challenge.
What a journey of corporate evolution. We've watched Uber move from the aggressive, chaotic personal risk under Kalanick to the calculated institutional resilience under Khosrowshahi. The company achieved strategic discipline, focus, and, undeniably improved cultural health.
But that achievement is shadowed by the deep skepticism and growing financial dissatisfaction among the hundreds of thousands of drivers globally. They're the ones forced to bear the brunt of the opaque economic policies designed to boost the bottom line.
The Khosrowshahi doctrine successfully forced a culture of accountability regarding ethical behavior and operational focus. It forced a conversation about why we suck at product development.
But genuine long-term transformation requires extending that radical self-critique from the quality of the product and the culture of the office to the equity of the economics.
It fixed the front door and the lobby, but the accounting office remains a black box.
Which raises a profound question that all platforms relying on a massive human workforce must eventually answer. What level of transparency and economic accountability is required for a platform to achieve long-term sustainable trust?
If the company's continuing success relies on exploiting the information gap and depressing the wages of its workforce, can the cultural transformation ever truly be called complete?
It's something for you to consider as you book your next ride or meal delivery. Is the convenience worth the cost of the candor? And what happens when the regulation finally catches up to the algorithm?